The sun was already sinking. When the cowboy first heard the sound, not a scream exactly, not yet, but the thin, breaking edge of one, carried on the wind like a thread about to snap. He reined his horse to a stop at the edge of the ravine and listened again, his hand hovering near the worn leather of his saddle horn, his eyes scanning the scrub and stone below. The desert around him was the kind that swallowed sound and mercy alike, a vast stretch of ochre earth and thorn brush, where men disappeared and were never spoken of again. He had been riding back to his homestead with a sack of grain and a rifle slung low across his back, his mind fixed on nothing more than the coming cold night when that sound found him. Another cry followed, clearer this time, unmistakably the voice of a child, and with it came a second, softer whimper, like an echo too weak to stand on its own. The cowboy, known in these parts as Eli, Carter swung down from his horse and tied the reins to a mesquite root. Moving with the caution of a man who knew the land had teeth, he slid down the ravine on foot, boots scraping loose stones, the smell of dust and sun-baked sage filling his lungs, until he saw them huddled together beneath an overhang of rock no bigger than a wagon bed. Two girls, no more than 10 and 8 by his reckoning, their dark hair tangled with sand and blood, their clothes torn and stiff with dirt. One clutched the other so tightly her knuckles had gone white, her eyes wide and shining with terror, fixed on him as if he were the next danger the world had decided to send. Eli froze where he stood and raised both hands slowly, palms open, his voice low and steady, the same tone he used with spooked horses. He told them he wasn't going to hurt them, that they were safe now, though he wasn't sure whether they understood his words or only the calm in his voice. He could see the signs easily enough, the beaded leather, strip still tied around one girl's wrist, the faint blue markings along the other's cheekbone, traditional Apache, paint worn thin by sweat and fear. These were Apache children and alone, in this territory. That meant trouble layered on top of danger, because white men feared Apaches, Apaches feared white men, and the desert cared for neither. The younger girl began to cry in earnest then, her small body shaking with exhaustion, and the older one stepped forward, placing herself squarely between her sister and the cowboy, despite the tremble in her legs. Eli felt something tighten in his chest, a memory rising unbidden of his own sister long buried back east, of a promise he'd failed to keep. He knelt slowly, lowering himself to their level, careful not to move too fast, and set his rifle on the ground a few feet away, sliding it aside with his boot so they could see he meant no harm. The older girl spoke then, her voice sharp with fear but steady with resolve, words in Apache that he didn't understand, though he understood the meaning well enough. She was warning him, telling him to stay back, telling him she would fight if she had to. Eli nodded as if he understood every syllable, and reached instead into his saddlebag, drawing out a strip of dried meat and a small tin of water. He set them on the ground between them and backed away a step, sitting on a rock and waiting. Time stretched thin as the desert sky deepened from gold to bruised purple. The girl stared at the food as if it might vanish, as if touching it would be a trap. At last the younger one crawled forward, her movements slow and careful, and snatched the meat before retreating into her sister's arms. They ate like children who had not eaten in days, chewing too fast, swallowing too quick, hands shaking. Eli watched their wrists, their ankles, the condition of their feet, cataloging injuries the way men who survive long enough always do. Scratches, bruises, cracked lips, but no obvious breaks. They had been running, hiding, lost, when the water was gone and the food reduced to crumbs. The older girl looked up at him again, something new in her eyes now, not trust, not yet, but the faint beginning of hope. She pointed east, then west, then pressed her hand flat against her chest and spoke a single word over and over, her voice breaking on it, "Mother." Even without understanding the language, Eli felt the weight of it settle into his bones. Night fell fast after that, and with it came the cold, sharp, and unforgiving. Eli knew better than to leave them there. Coyotes were already starting up in the distance, their calls echoing like laughter. He stood and took a slow step toward them, then another, watching their reactions. stopping whenever the older girl stiffened. He gestured toward his horse and mimed riding, then pointed back at them and at himself, making a circle in the air as if to say together. The older girl hesitated, then shook her head fiercely, clutching her sister tighter. Eli exhaled slowly. He couldn't force them. Forcing them would make him no better than the men who hunted children for bounty or sport. Instead, he shrugged out of his coat, a heavy, weathered thing that still held some warmth, and laid it across the girl's shoulders before stepping back again. The younger girl immediately wrapped herself in it, sighing as if she hadn't known she could feel warmth anymore. That small sound decided it. Eli turned and walked back toward his horse, not looking back, trusting that desperation and instinct would do what words could not. He'd taken no more than 10 steps when he heard the scrape of stone behind him. He turned slowly and saw them standing there, the older one still wary, the younger half hidden behind her, both wrapped in his coat like a promise they weren't ready to believe. He smiled then just a little, and led them up the ravine and onto the open plain beyond. The ride back to his homestead was slow and careful. He lifted the younger girl up onto the saddle first, then helped the older one climb up behind her, positioning himself on foot at the horse's head, leading it by the reins so they wouldn't fall. The moon rose full and bright, painting the land in silver and shadow, revealing just how empty the world could be. The girls said little, whispering to each other in their own language, the older one's hand never leaving the younger's waist. Every so often the younger would lean forward and rest her head against Eli's back, exhaustion finally winning out over fear. Each time she did, the older girl stiffened, watching him for any sign of betrayal, and each time he pretended not to notice, keeping his pace steady, his gaze fixed ahead. When they reached his cabin, a squat, weather-beaten structure, crouched against the land as if trying not to be seen, the girls froze again, their fear spiking at the sight of the dark doorway. Eli lit a lantern and hung it outside first, letting the warm glow spill out into the night, then opened the door and stepped back, inviting them in without entering himself. After a long moment, the older girl nodded once and guided her sister down, the two of them stepping inside together like soldiers crossing a line. Eli followed last, careful to keep his movements slow, setting about making a fire and heating water as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. He gave them the bed, rough as it was, and took a blanket for himself near the hearth. As the fire crackled and the wind whispered against the walls, he lay awake listening to their breathing, to the small murmurs of a language older than his own, and wondered what kind of mother would let her children cross such a land alone. He wondered if she was still alive. He wondered, too, what kind of trouble would come knocking at his door with the morning light, because in the West, no good deed ever traveled alone. Morning came pale and cold, creeping over the desert like a cautious visitor, and Eli was awake long before the first light touched the horizon. He lay still on the hard floor near the hearth, listening, counting breaths, the habit of a man who had learned not to trust silence. The girls slept tangled together on the bed, his coat still wrapped around their small shoulders, the older one's arm flung protectively across her sister's chest, even in sleep. The fire had burned down to embers, but the room held on to just enough warmth to keep the cold from biting too deep. Eli rose quietly, easing his boots on and stepping outside to check the perimeter. The land looked unchanged in the dawn light, endless scrub, low hills, and the distant line of mountains, but he knew better. Tracks told stories, and stories meant danger if you didn't read them right. He circled the cabin, crouching low, scanning the dirt for signs of movement. Coyote tracks old. A deer passed through sometime in the night. No boot prints, no hoof marks that didn't belong to his horse. He let out a slow breath and straightened, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. Whatever had driven the girls into his path had not followed them this far. Not yet. When he stepped back inside, the older girl was awake, sitting upright on the bed with her back straight and her chin lifted, watching him with eyes far too old for her years. The younger one slept on, curled into her sister's side, her mouth slightly open, a faint frown still creasing her brow even in rest. Eli paused in the doorway and gave a small nod, a gesture of respect more than greeting. He went about his morning routine with deliberate normalcy, pouring water into a pot, setting it on the fire, slicing a bit of salted pork and laying it in a pan. The smells filled the small cabin, rich and comforting, and he saw the older girl's nostrils flare despite herself. Hunger had a way of cutting through fear faster than anything else. He set 2 tin cups on the table and poured water, then added a bit of coffee for himself, leaving theirs plain. When the food was ready, he set a portion on a plate and placed it on the table, then stepped back and sat on a stool near the wall, giving them space. The older girl hesitated, then shook her sister gently awake. The younger blinked, confused, then smiled faintly when she saw the food, her fear momentarily forgotten. They ate quietly, the older one still watching Eli between bites, her posture tense but no longer hostile. When they were done, the older girl spoke again, more slowly this time, pointing to herself and then to her sister, saying their names in Apache, sounds that rolled and clicked in a way Eli could not hope to repeat. He pointed to himself and said his own name, tapping his chest. Eli, she tried to say it, her brow furrowing as she shaped the unfamiliar syllables, then nodded once as if filing it away. She pointed to the door, then to the rising sun, then drew a rough line across the table with her finger, mimicking the shape of the distant mountains. She spoke at length then, her words tumbling out, her hands moving as much as her mouth. Eli listened carefully, catching what he could from tone and gesture. They had been traveling with their mother. Something had happened, an attack perhaps, or sickness. There had been shouting, running, smoke. The girls had been told to hide, to keep going no matter what. The older one's voice wavered when she reached this part, her hand clenching into a fist against the tabletop. Eli felt the weight of it settle deeper into him. He nodded slowly, then pointed back toward the mountains she'd indicated. Raising his brows in a question, she nodded vigorously. Mother alive? The girl hesitated, then pressed her lips together and shrugged, a small, broken gesture that said everything words could not. Hope without certainty was a heavy thing for a child to carry. Eli stood and went to a small chest in the corner, pulling out a scrap of paper and a stub of charcoal. He knelt by the table and began to sketch, rough lines forming the shape of the land, the cabin, the ravine where he'd found them, the mountains beyond. He pointed to the cabin, then to himself, then to them, then drew a line toward the mountains and looked at the older girl. Understanding flickered in her eyes. She shook her head sharply, fear flashing back into her gaze. She spoke quickly, her voice urgent, pointing outside, then making a slicing motion with her hand. Danger. Men. Eli frowned. He thought of the stories, militia patrols, bounty hunters, settlers who saw every Apache as an enemy, every child as a future threat. He couldn't deny the risk. Taking them back could get them killed. Keeping them could bring trouble down on his head. The older girl watched him wrestle with the choice, her small hands clenched in her lap, waiting to see what kind of man he was. At last he tapped the paper again, drew a circle around the cabin, then a line out and back, pointing to the sun's position as if to say, today. He would go and look. He would not leave them alone. He would come back. The girl studied his face, searching for lies, then nodded once slowly, as if granting permission. She had no right to give, but felt responsible for all the same. He prepared to leave with care, packing food, water, and ammunition, then stopped and looked at the girls. He pointed to the bed, to the firewood, to the door, miming locking it from the inside. He placed the rifle against the wall, far from their reach but visible, and mimed using it only if absolutely necessary, his face serious. The older girl nodded, repeating his gestures, committing them to memory. Before he left, the younger girl reached out and caught his sleeve, her small fingers warm and trusting. She said something softly, a single word, her eyes shining. Eli didn't know what it meant, but he smiled anyway and patted her hand gently before stepping out into the morning light. The desert greeted him with a harsh clarity, every sound sharp, every shadow suspect. He followed the line the older girl had drawn in the air, moving fast but cautious, reading the ground as he went. Before long, He found the signs he'd been hoping not to see and fearing all the same. Broken brush. Scattered footprints, small ones, larger ones, boot prints cutting across them at odd angles. Ash from an old fire. And blood. Not much, but enough. His jaw tightened. He followed the trail for hours, the sun climbing higher, until he reached the place where the land bore the scars of violence. A burned-out wagon lay tipped on its side, its wheels charred, its contents scattered. The ground was churned with tracks, the story clear enough even without knowing every word. An ambush. He found a scrap of cloth caught on a thorn bush, stained dark, and lifted it carefully. Apache work, a woman's garment. He closed his eyes briefly, then tucked it into his pocket. He searched the area thoroughly, calling out once, softly, then again, louder, his voice swallowed by the open land. There was no answer. No body, at least not here. That, he told himself, was something. He marked the place in his mind, then turned back toward the cabin, the weight of responsibility heavier with every step. Whatever fate had befallen the girl's mother, it had not finished unfolding yet, and Eli knew deep down that by stepping into it, he had tied his own future to theirs in ways he could not yet see. By the time Eli reached the cabin again, the sun was already leaning west, the day slipping through his fingers faster than he liked. He slowed his pace as he approached, senses stretched tight, every instinct listening for what shouldn't be there. Smoke still rose thin and steady from the chimney. Good. The door stood just as he'd left it. Better. He circled wide anyway, checking the ground, reading the dirt like a ledger. 2 small sets of footprints, near the woodpile where he'd shown them. How to fetch kindling, no others. Relief loosened something in his chest that he hadn't realized was clenched so hard. When he finally stepped inside, the girls both looked up at once. The younger one ran to him without hesitation, throwing her arms around his leg, with a quiet sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep and buried. The older girl followed more slowly, her relief carefully controlled. But her eyes betrayed her when she saw his empty hands and then his face. She searched him for answers before he'd even spoken. Eli knelt and gently freed himself from the younger's grip, steadying her with a hand on her shoulder, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the scrap of cloth. He didn't hand it to the older girl, didn't need to. He let her see it. Her breath caught, sharp and painful, and she turned away quickly, pressing her fist to her mouth. She said nothing, but her shoulders trembled. Eli wished fiercely that he had better news to give. He crouched there for a long moment, letting the silence do the talking, letting grief arrive in its own time. That night passed heavier than the one before. The girls spoke in whispers long after the lantern had been dimmed, their voices rising and falling like a prayer and a protest all at once. Eli lay awake again, staring up at the rough beams overhead, the image of the burned wagon etched behind his eyes. He thought about the way the older girl had taken responsibility without being asked, the way she carried fear like a blade she was ready to use if needed. He thought about the men who'd done this, whoever they were, and felt a slow, dangerous anger settle into him. When dawn came, it came quiet and gray, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Eli made breakfast, and this time the girls ate without hesitation, hunger and exhaustion dulling the sharpest edges of fear. When they were finished, the older girl surprised him by standing and speaking firmly, her words deliberate, her gestures clear. She pointed to the door, to the land beyond, then to the mountains again. Then she pressed her palm to her heart and lifted her chin. She was telling him she wanted to go, to look, to find her mother or the truth of her fate. Eli shook his head slowly, raising a hand. Too dangerous. He mimed men with guns, fire, death. She didn't flinch. She repeated the gesture to her heart, then pointed to her sister, then to the land. This was who she was. This was what she had to do. Eli stood and paced the length of the cabin, running a hand through his hair. He knew the land, knew the risks, knew how often stubborn courage ended in blood. But he also knew that stopping her outright would break something vital in her, something that once broken never quite healed right. At last he exhaled and nodded once. He packed quickly, more carefully this time. Extra water, Bandages, his rifle cleaned and loaded, his knife strapped where it was easy to reach. He knelt in front of the younger girl and spoke softly, words she didn't fully understand, but whose meaning lived in his eyes. Stay safe. The older girl listened closely, absorbing everything. Before they left, she went to the small shelf near the hearth and took a carved wooden charm Eli hadn't noticed before, something she must have made from scrap during the night. She pressed it into his hand, her fingers closing around his briefly, her gaze steady and solemn. A promise or a thanks or both. Eli tucked it into his shirt pocket like something sacred. They traveled only a short distance that day, moving slow, alert, scanning the horizon. The land offered little comfort, but it offered clues. More tracks, older now, scattered signs of movement heading toward a narrow pass between two ridges. Eli felt the weight of being watched long before he saw anything. He raised a hand, stopping them both, and listened. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint sound of hooves. Not many, 2, maybe 3 riders. Eli guided the girls into a shallow cut in the land and motioned for them to stay low. He crept forward just enough to see 3 men on horseback, moving careless and loud, rifles slung easy, laughter carrying too far. Not soldiers, not Apaches. Settlers or drifters, the worst kind when they traveled in groups. One of them dragged something behind his saddle, cloth torn and stained. Eli's blood ran cold. He watched until they passed out of sight, then backed away slowly, heart hammering. The older girl had seen it too. Her face had gone rigid, her jaw set hard enough to crack stone. She spoke rapidly, angrily, words tumbling out like thrown knives. Eli didn't need translation to know she'd recognized the cloth. He shook his head firmly. Not now, not like this. He pointed back toward the cabin, then to the sun. Now climbing high, retreat, regroup, live. She stared at him, hatred and grief burning bright, then finally nodded. The fight draining out of her in a rush that left her looking smaller, younger. They returned to the cabin in silence, the weight of what they'd seen hanging thick between them. Eli barred the door that night and kept his rifle close. Sleep came in broken pieces. Dreams full of fire and running. Feet and a woman's voice calling names he couldn't hear clearly. Near dawn, a sound woke him sharp and sudden, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps outside. He was on his feet in an instant, rifle raised, heart pounding. A voice followed, low and steady, not English, Apache, a woman's voice. Eli froze, every hair on his body standing on end. The older girl sat bolt upright, eyes wide, then scrambled from the bed, her breath hitching. She ran to the door and pressed her ear against it, whispering a single word over and over, her voice breaking as hope and fear collided. Mother. The knock came again, gentle this time, followed by more words, urgent and strained. Eli moved to the door, hesitated only a moment, then drew the bolt and opened it slowly. In the pale light of early morning stood a woman worn thin by hardship, her hair streaked with gray and dust, her eyes fierce despite the pain etched into her face. She took one look past him, saw her daughters, and fell to her knees in the dirt, a sound tearing from her chest that was equal parts sob and prayer. The girls rushed forward, clinging to her, all 3 of them tangled together, alive against all odds. Eli stood back and watched, heart heavy and full all at once, knowing without knowing how that this reunion was not the end of the story, but the beginning of something far stranger than he could imagine. The woman did not rise for a long while. She stayed there on her knees in the dust, just beyond the threshold, her arms wrapped tight around her daughters as if the earth itself might try to take them back if she loosened her grip. She spoke in a rush of Apache, her voice rough and trembling, pressing her forehead to each girl in turn, touching their faces, their hair, their hands, counting them with her fingers like someone afraid. Numbers might change when she looked away. Eli stepped back into the cabin to give them space, lowering his rifle and resting it against the wall, suddenly aware of how large and out of place he must seem in this moment that had nothing to do with him. He busied himself with the fire, adding wood he didn't need to add, listening as the girls answered their mother in quick, overlapping bursts. From tone alone, he could hear the story being poured out. Fear, running, the ravine, the strange white man who hadn't hurt them, who had fed them and given them warmth. Every so often, the woman's gaze flicked up to Eli, sharp and assessing, the look of someone who had survived by trusting no one. When at last she rose, she did so with visible effort. One hand braced against the doorframe, her other arm wrapped protectively around the younger girl's shoulders. Up close, Eli could see the cost of whatever she'd endured. A bandage of crude cloth wrapped her ribs. Dried blood darkened the edge of her sleeve. Her movements were stiff, pained, and yet, when she straightened and faced him fully, there was nothing weak in her posture. She spoke first in Apache, then tried again in broken English, the words clearly learned long ago and seldom used. She named herself Atsa, a name that carried weight, even if Eli could not yet feel all of it. She placed a hand on her chest, then pointed to her daughters as she named them again, slower this time, making sure he heard. When she reached his name, she paused, searching his face as if committing it to memory. "Eli," she said carefully, then nodded once. Gratitude came next, but not in the way he expected. There was no gushing, no tears turned outward. Instead, she bowed her head briefly, a gesture, so solemn it felt ceremonial, and spoke a sentence in Apache that made the older girl's eyes widen. The girl translated with her hands and expression more than words, pointing to Eli, then to the fire, then drawing a circle in the air and touching her. "Heart, safe, life, owed." Eli shook his head, uncomfortable, and waved it off, mumbling that anyone would have done the same. Atsa studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes unblinking. "Not anyone," she said quietly, the English rough but clear enough. "Many men pass. Few stop." They stayed that day. Atsa was in no condition to travel far, and Eli would not have allowed it even if she had been. He set about making the cabin ready for more people than it was built to hold. Hanging blankets to divide the space, heating water for her wounds. Atsa watched him work, silent, her gaze following his every movement, noting how he kept his back to the wall when he knelt, how his hand never strayed far from his knife, how he spoke to the girls with gentleness that did not slip into pity. When he offered to tend her injuries, she hesitated only a moment before nodding. She endured the cleaning and rewrapping of her ribs without a sound, though sweat beaded on her brow. Up close, Eli could see the faint scars that mapped her skin, the history of survival written in lines and marks that told stories he would never fully hear. When he was done, she met his eyes and said a single word in Apache, her voice firm, "Truth." He nodded, not entirely sure what promise he had just made, but knowing instinctively that it mattered. As the day wore on, Atsa told her story in fragments, filling the air with meaning even where words failed. They had been traveling with a small group, moving camp under pressure from encroaching settlers and patrols. The attack had come at dusk, gunfire, shouting, fire thrown into the wagon carrying supplies. She had fought, wounded one man, been struck down in return. In the chaos, she had ordered her daughters to run, to hide, to keep going, no matter what they heard. She had crawled away when night fell, hiding among the rocks, waiting until the riders moved on. By the time she could walk again, the trail was cold, the land wide and merciless. She had followed signs for days, driven by little more than blood loss and the certainty that if she stopped, she would die and take her daughter's fate with her. When she spoke of finding Eli's cabin tracks, her voice softened for the first time. She touched the carved charm at his shirt pocket, recognizing it instantly, and something like relief crossed her face. "My daughter chooses well," she said simply, but relief did not erase danger. As the light began to fade, Atsa's expression hardened again. She spoke urgently, gesturing toward the door, toward the distant hills. Men were near, the same men Eli had seen that day, or others like them. They were hunting not just for Apaches, but for witnesses, for anything that might threaten them. Eli felt the room tighten around them. He thought of his isolation, of how the cabin that had once felt like a refuge now felt like a beacon. He went to the door and looked out across the land, the horizon glowing red as the sun dipped low. A choice loomed, heavy and unavoidable. Stay and defend, risking everything, or move, injured woman and all, into a land that did not forgive weakness. As he turned back, Atsa was watching him closely, something unreadable in her gaze. When she spoke again, her words came slow and deliberate, each one placed like a stone. "You saved my children," she said. "Tomorrow I repay the debt." Eli frowned, about to protest. But she raised a hand, silencing him. "Not with gold," she added. "With what you do not yet see." The fire cracked loudly in the hearth, sending sparks up the chimney, and in that sound, Eli felt the first stirring of unease. Whatever reward she meant to give him, he suspected it would bind his fate to hers far more tightly than any thanks ever could. The night that followed carried a different kind of tension, one that pressed in from all sides. Heavy and watchful, Eli did not sleep. He sat near the door with his rifle across his knees. The lantern turned low, listening to the land breathe. Atsa rested fitfully on the bed. The girls curled against her, their small forms rising and falling in unison. Every so often Atsa would murmur in Apache, words meant to soothe or warn, Eli couldn't tell which, and the girls would settle again. Outside the wind shifted, carrying distant sounds, an owl's call, the snap of brush, once the unmistakable echo of a horse's snort far off. Eli tightened his grip on the rifle, counting heartbeats, measuring distance in his mind. When dawn finally came, it did not bring relief so much as clarity. Staying was no longer an option. The men Atsa feared would come, whether today or tomorrow, and when they did, a lone cabin with a wounded woman and 2 children would be nothing but an easy mark. Atsa was already awake when the first light crept through the cracks in the walls. She sat upright, her back straight despite the pain it must have cost her, her gaze fixed on the door as if she could see through it. She spoke before Eli could. "We go east," she said, pointing with her chin. "To the red stones." Eli knew the place she meant, a stretch of broken land cut with narrow canyons and towering rock faces, a place settlers avoided because sound carried strangely there and riders could vanish without a trace. It was defensible if you knew it, deadly if you didn't. He nodded slowly. "It's a hard ride," he said. Atsa met his eyes. "Hard keeps us alive." There was no argument left to make. They packed quickly, taking only what they could carry. Eli loaded his horse carefully, then helped Atsa mount, steadying her when she winced. The girls climbed up behind her, their small hands gripping cloth and leather, their faces solemn but determined. Before leaving, Atsa stepped back into the cabin one last time. She moved with purpose, kneeling by the hearth, pressing her palm to the earth, murmuring something too low for Eli to hear. When she rose, she carried a small bundle wrapped in hide. She did not explain. She only looked at him and said, "For the road." He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. They traveled in silence, moving through the land like a single thought, careful and measured. Eli ranged ahead on foot at times, scanning ridges and gullies, then fell back to lead the horse when the terrain grew treacherous. Atsa guided them with quiet gestures, choosing paths that seemed invisible to anyone without her knowledge. More than once, they heard riders in the distance, voices carried on the wind, the jingle of tack, and each time Atsa steered them off the trail, into stone and shadow, where they waited, breath held, until the danger passed. The girls had learned the art of stillness well. They did not cry. They did not fidget. They watched their mother and did as she did, small faces set with a seriousness that made Eli ache. By midday, the red stones rose before them, jagged and immense, their shadows pooling dark and cool at their base. Atsa let out a long breath, the first sign of relief Eli had seen from her. "Here," she said. "Now you see." They led the horse into a narrow cleft between 2 towering walls of rock, the passage twisting and turning until the outside world seemed to fall away entirely. Sound changed there, muffled and strange, every footstep echoing as if the stone itself were listening. Atsa dismounted with Eli's help and motioned for him to follow her, deeper into the canyon. At last they reached a place where the walls opened into a hidden basin, green with scrub and fed by a thin trickle of water that gleamed like a silver thread. Eli stopped short, stunned. He had ridden this land for years and never known this place existed. Atsa watched his reaction closely, a faint, knowing curve to her mouth. "Not on your maps," she said. "But on ours." She gestured to the girls who ran ahead now, laughter bubbling up despite themselves as they knelt by the water, splashing their hands. The sound echoed soft and bright, a fragile thing in a hard world. They made camp there, hidden and safe for the moment. Atsa's strength seemed to return in the shelter of the canyon, her movements steadier, her eyes clearer. When the fire was lit and food shared, she finally untied the hide bundle she had carried. From it, she drew objects wrapped carefully in cloth, small, worn things that looked unremarkable at first glance. A bone charm etched with symbols, a braided cord darkened with age, and finally, a pouch that clinked softly when she set it down. Eli watched in silence as she laid them out on a flat stone. Atsa knelt opposite him, her posture formal now, her gaze unwavering. "You think reward is money," she said quietly. "Or land or horse?" She shook her head. "Those things pass." She picked up the bone charm and held it between them. "This does not." She told him then of her people, of old ways and promises, bound not by paper, but by blood and memory. The charm, she said, marked a protector, someone who had acted without taking, who had given life without asking for it. Such a person, once recognized, was owed more than thanks. They were owed loyalty, warning, shelter if ever needed. The land itself, she said, would remember. Eli felt a slow, uneasy awe settle over him. He had expected gold, perhaps, or a horse, something he could refuse politely. This was something else entirely, something that carried weight he did not know how to measure. Before he could speak, a distant sound rolled through the canyon, the unmistakable echo of a gunshot, followed by shouting distorted by stone. The girls froze. Atsa's head snapped up, her eyes hard. She gathered the charms quickly, pressing the bone one into Eli's hand and closing his fingers around it with surprising strength. "Now," she said. "You understand." She rose, already moving toward the canyon's edge, her daughters at her side. They followed. The calm in her voice was gone, replaced by something sharp and resolute. Eli stood, the bone charm warm in his palm, the weight of her. Strange reward suddenly very real. Whatever this bond meant, it was about to be tested, and the canyon that had offered them shelter was about to become a battlefield. The canyon seemed to hold its breath as the echoes of the gunshot faded. The sound swallowed and reshaped by stone until it felt as though it came from everywhere at once. Eli moved without thinking, years of survival cutting through fear and doubt. He guided the girls behind a low rise of rock near the water, motioning for them to stay low, to stay silent. Atsa did not argue or panic. She flowed into motion beside him, her injured side forgotten, her eyes sharp and focused, scanning the canyon mouth where dust now drifted like a warning. From above came the clatter of hooves and the scrape of boots on stone. The men were close, closer than Eli had hoped, their voices bouncing off the canyon walls in a confusing chorus. There were 3 of them, maybe 4, spread out, careless in their confidence, unaware that the land itself had turned against them. Eli felt the bone charm in his pocket press against his chest, absurd and grounding all at once. And for a fleeting moment he wondered if Atsa was right, if the land truly did remember. The first rider entered the narrow passage just as Eli had positioned himself behind a jagged outcrop. Eli waited, counting the man's steps by the rhythm of his boots, then struck fast and clean, knocking the rifle from his hands and sending him sprawling into the dust. The sound echoed like thunder, but the canyon swallowed it quickly. Atsa moved at the same instant, emerging from the shadows with a stone in her hand, striking another man across the temple with a precision that spoke of long practice. Chaos erupted. Shouts rang out, sharp and panicked now. Gunfire cracking and ricocheting wildly off stone, bullets sparking uselessly against rock. Eli fired once, deliberately, driving the 3rd man back toward the narrowest part of the passage, where his horse reared and blocked escape. The man cursed, fear finally breaking. Through bravado, and scrambled away, dragging his injured companion with him. Within moments, the canyon fell silent again, the echoes fading like ghosts retreating. Eli stood still, breathing hard, listening for pursuit that did not come. When he was certain the danger had passed for now, he lowered his rifle. The girls emerged slowly from their hiding place, eyes wide but unbroken. The younger ran to her mother first, clutching her tightly, while the older lingered, watching. Eli with something new in her gaze, something that looked a lot like understanding. Atsa leaned heavily against the rock, the fight having taken more from her than she would admit. But when she straightened, she did so with dignity intact. She looked at Eli for a long moment, then nodded once, deep and solemn. "The debt is paid," she said quietly. "Now the bond remains." She reached into the pouch again and withdrew the braided cord, tying it carefully around Eli's wrist. The fibers were rough, the knot firm. "If you wear this," she continued, "my people will know you. They will not raise a weapon against you. They will hide you. They will warn you when danger walks your trail." Eli swallowed, the weight of it settling into him fully now. This was no token. It was a promise woven into flesh and future. They stayed in the hidden basin until night fell, the canyon once again becoming a place of shelter rather than threat. The men did not return. Perhaps fear had finally taught them what maps and rifles never could. When it was safe to move, Atsa prepared to leave. She would take her daughters deeper into the land, back to places Eli would never see and paths he could never follow. At the canyon's edge, she stopped and turned to him one last time. She placed her hand over the bone charm still tucked into his shirt and met his eyes. "You saved my children," she said again. But this time the words carried a different weight. "So my people will save you when the time comes." The girls embraced him then, even the older one, who pressed her forehead briefly against his chest before stepping back. They vanished into the stone and shadow, their figures swallowed by the land, as if they had always belonged to it and he never had. Eli returned to his cabin alone, the desert stretching wide and familiar once more, yet subtly changed. Days passed, then weeks. Life resumed its quiet rhythm, mending fences, hauling water, watching the horizon. But he noticed things now, tracks that seemed to warn him away from certain paths, distant figures on ridgelines that vanished when he approached, always leaving signs of danger narrowly avoided. Once when a patrol rode too close, he found a braided cord like his own, tied to a mesquite branch near his trail, a silent message that sent him another way just in time. He never spoke of Atsa or her daughters, not to anyone who would not understand. He wore the cord until it frayed, then tied it again, and on cold nights, when the wind carried strange echoes across the land, he sometimes thought he heard laughter near the water, or a woman's voice calling softly, not in warning but in remembrance. In the end, Eli came to understand the true nature of the strange reward, not gold, not power, but belonging. In a land where survival often meant standing alone, he had been woven, quietly and irrevocably, into something older, deeper, and far more enduring than himself.